Control is a haunting and messy technical marvel that stumbles on Orphic ideas such as Jungian synchronicity and the astral plane, but manages to keep its footing just enough to capture the player's imagination. However, it's held back by awkward dialogue and facial animations that damper any intrigue the player may have. As you'd expect from Remedy, combat is visceral, and while it does take longer to get going than I'd like, once Control allows full access to its battle systems, it provides a very satisfying moment-to-moment loop. The artistic and technical skill on display here is simply stunning. Industrial architecture and carefully placed lighting push the player to scour the oldest house's labyrinthian rooms. The environments are just as much a character as any NPC. Control is worth playing for these aspects alone.
I don't know what.
Should I really be doing a review of Control years after it came out? I mean... Oh, the algorithm doesn't care about me? But I thought... You're right, Polaris. Let's do this.
Stolen by our friends at the CIA.
A director needs a team.
An object of power. Never heard of it. But around here, I assume everything's classified.
What scares me shitless is that I finally found it. Only to see the hiss destroy it all.
I'm going to start this review by discussing combat and exploration, followed by the story and world building. So if there are some proper nouns or acronyms said in this section that aren't super clear, don't worry, they will be fully explained later in the video. So Jesse Faden, the protagonist of our tale and newly appointed director of the Federal Bureau of Control, begins with a very limited moveset and arsenal that slowly grows as she journeys into the unknown depths of the oldest house. From telekinesis, to flying, to mind control, Jessie gains a solid variety of abilities to destroy her enemies, the Hiss, who are former employees of the FBC. In addition to new powers, Jessie also picks up new transformations for her one and only armament, the service weapon. Shotgun, sniper, minigun, the usual archetypes are present and generally effective for particular situations. Now, I'll admit the combat did not grab me until several hours and discovered powers later. I was anxious about how repetitive each skirmish felt in those early stages. Shoot some hiss, hurl a chunk of something while the ammo recharged, rinse, and repeat. Was this all I would experience? My disappointment didn't last though. Surprisingly, this basic formula doesn't change much as the campaign progresses, but the addition of new abilities and enemy combinations goes a long way to dialing up the intensity. Dodging rockets or grenades while keeping track of hiss charged barreling from all directions kept me constantly moving and changing tactics. Enemies gain their own abilities too, such as flight or armor, to mirror Jessie's growth. So strategies that worked in the early game don't necessarily translate to wins in the late game. Each battle arena also brought its own challenges and tactics. I needed to quickly assess my advantages each time I entered a room. What items are strewn about for launching at opponents? Are there areas for cover? What sort of verticality exists? Is there a lot of room to maneuver, or is it cramped? These observations became more crucial as the campaign ramps up its difficulty and demands more from the player. Control's combat encounters play like a game of chess more than checkers. The pieces are simple and easy to understand, but the strategies in any given situation are numerous. Jessie's movement, both horizontal and vertical, opens up the possibilities for evasion and counter. Switching between various modes of the service weapon and employing telekinesis or mind control makes Jessie feel like a multi-tool capable of addressing any problem that needs fixing. On top of that, players might not discover all the abilities in the same order or even at all. but let's put a pin in that, as how the player obtains powers strongly relates to exploration. Overall, everything felt very fluid and engaging, but that's not to say the combat systems aren't perfect. As I said earlier, the combat shines after Jessie gains the majority of her powers. It's the in-between period that is a bit of a slog. To continue the metaphor, it would be like playing chess with only pawns. Sure, there's still a sense of depth, but it's going to be really monotonous. I feel Jessie should have started with all of her powers or received them within the first 2 or 3 hours. Enemy types could then be rolled out sooner, and the complexities could begin to stack beyond what Control's current state allows. I only really found a flow in the combat once all the pieces came together and the enemy combinations diversified. Beyond that, Control falls apart in its supplementary systems. The system that works best, although that's not saying much, is the skill tree, and I'm using the term skill tree very loosely here. As Jessie completes missions and kills enemies, she will earn experience towards leveling up. Gaining a level will provide points that can be placed in several categories ranging from more health to greater energy efficiency. Generally, investing these points did not make any significant changes to how I played the game, even though there were a lot of options. I could survive longer or launch more items, but I only needed to do that because the enemies leveled up too. Unfortunately, this idea of forcing RPG mechanics into action games is industry standard at this point, and in most cases takes away from the best parts of an action game, which is getting better at playing the game. Borderlands has this problem too, which I discuss in depth in another video series, but I'm seeing this more and more in modern games. Artificially inflating the numbers does not mean the game is better, it just means the numbers are bigger. Giving the player the opportunity to increase their health capacity inevitably means enemies will do more damage to counterbalance. My strategies aren't different. Nothing of impact changes. My problem with this? Why go to the trouble of creating the skill tree if I can't tell a difference in my play? Jessie should gain different abilities or enhancements that change the mechanics of play. Have Jessie's dash do damage. Let the service weapon expend ammo to create melee combos. Allow possessed enemies to act as a shield, or let the player manually explode them. Heck, when Jessie possesses them, let the player give commands or even control the opposition. There are hundreds of ways Jessie could grow mechanically instead of just through stats. The second supporting system is mods for both Jessie and the service weapon. Honestly, these are pretty garbage. The game frequently forced me to enter my inventory to clear space or switch out a low-level mod for a high-level one that does the same thing, only with larger numbers. Again, I'm irritated by this and feel it's a wasted opportunity to really dial up the diversity of play. I'm not going to spend any more time on this, just know I didn't enjoy it at all. Control would be better off taking one of two routes. Either remove all the mods and skill tree nonsense and concentrate on building up the player's skills by throwing more complicated scenarios at them, or make the skill points and mods actually count for something. There's nothing inherently wrong with skills or mods that make the numbers go big, but if that's the only thing that's happening, I'm not really invested or interested. Force me to do a new strategy. Force me to learn a new skill. Don't change the numbers and pretend there's depth. I do want to make something clear before I move on though. The combat in Control is very fun once it gets going, and despite some areas that I feel need improvement, the fun factor is all that really matters at the end of the day. Everything else would only elevate that.
A lot of roadside motels across the country, on the run under the radar. This feels like all of them, like something recognized from a dream.
I'm conflicted with the exploration of the oldest house, but I'll freely admit my confliction is entirely of my own creation. On the one hand, space is a premium from a world-building perspective. The oldest house shifts and molds to essentially whatever it wants, with the exception of a scattering of areas. These more permanent sections are maintained by control points that also serve as fast travel locations for the player. Permanence is a rare thing in the universe of Control, so having certain locations remain relatively unchanged allows both the player and Jesse to ease into the idea of the unconsciousness manifesting real alterations in the world. Environments are dense with detail and range from grand halls to industrial maintenance areas to the astral plane. Realistic office spaces mixed with brutalism gets pushed to their expected extremes, again because of the oldest house's tendency to distort the familiar into the uncanny. This gives FBC headquarters a bizarre sense of intimacy with its spaces that I honestly wasn't expecting, especially as I retread areas using newer abilities. I prefer worlds that allow me to learn the minutiae rather than larger ones that almost mandate map markers and hand-holding. I feel smarter and my discoveries more earned. A desk with papers, a computer, and various office supplies is normal to see in Control. A desk with papers, a computer, and various office supplies attached to the ceiling is unnerving. Seeing these everyday scenarios get twisted immerses the player with excellent environmental storytelling, and this is one of Control's strongest positives. Everywhere I went, I could connect the lore I read from Collectibles with tangible events in front of me. For example, there are a series of entries related to the FBC's book club. At first, I simply thought these to be a neat side story to fill the world's characters. However, I soon realized these book club members can be found throughout the oldest house. Their communications about the books they read played out in the game world. Needless to say, I found this to be very surprising, and it forced me to really pay attention to what all the collectibles and lore entries were telling me. Again, the environmental storytelling is great, and I encourage anyone who plays this game to take their time understanding the lore, as it will increase their appreciation of the world Remedy built. I have a lot more to say regarding lore and story, but we'll save that for later on in the video. Okay, now that I've laid the groundwork for what the world is like, let's talk about exploration in a more palpable fashion. Much like in combat encounters, Jessie's movement plays a big part in her ability to explore all the nooks and crannies of the oldest house. Unlike combat, her slow gain of powers didn't bother me here, and actually reminded me of a Metroidvania game, albeit in a much less cohesive manner. And this is where my confliction comes in. I believe Remedy did their best to create a believable world that meshes well with their game's systems. And honestly, it works well. I don't really have complaints about exploring the oldest house. I'm not a huge fan of the security card gimmick, as it feels like a mechanic from a 90s FPS, but it's also realistic for Control's world, so I let it slide. So why exactly am I conflicted? I'm conflicted because I can see the potential. Immense potential. While flitting between areas, I couldn't help but think of games like Metroid Prime or Shadow Complex, and how they integrated mastering abilities with exploration. And while those games were restricted by the universes they existed within, Control finds itself in the unique situation of making almost any structure imaginable without qualms. Any zany idea can be manifested and this is the key part, have it make sense to the story and player. I can't think of another game of this style that could do something like that. The flashes are there too. At certain points, the level designers cut loose with twisting hallways or transformative rooms that force the player to question perspective. In particular, the ashtray maze stands out with its multi-level structures and shifting platforms, and all of this could be dialed up even more without taking anything away. Much like my How to Fix Borderlands series, I want to discuss a few ideas I have that could have pushed Control into a league of its own. As is tradition with that series, I will be displaying a list. Number 1. Allow Jessie to transform the environment. This seems really obvious to me. With her ability to move objects with her mind and a clear connection to the board and oldest house, some classic box and platform puzzles are in order. Allow her to create platforms from objects, let her shift walls or even the gravity of a room by rotating the entire structure. Like the golden gauntlets from Ocarina of Time, Jessie could lift gigantic obstacles to access hidden rooms or use those obstacles to reach other areas. Branching moments could allow Jessie to decide on closing off one area to reach another, or create a room where there wasn't one previously, but at the cost of something else. There's just so much that could be done here that there's no way I could do it justice. Number 2, take advantage of Jessie's powers more. As the story progresses, Jessie gains a number of abilities, most of them centered around telekinesis. But outside of a few platforming sections or tucked away loot boxes, these abilities play a minimal role in exploring the oldest house. So what do I mean by taking advantage? As an example, Jessie could use her mind control to access an area normally blocked off to those who aren't Hiss. To go along with my combat suggestions from earlier, if Jessie is given the ability to actually control the actions of Hiss, she could have possessed Hiss activate a control point in a sealed area, which would then allow her to fast travel to that point. If the player goes in guns blazing, they might miss an opportunity to reach an unknown space. Combine Jessie's powers with my suggestion of environment manipulation, and suddenly the world opens up. The oldest house can delve into some crazy and fun locations that all fit within the universe created by Remedy. As a side note, the spaces of control really make me think of Portal. A power that let Jessie act like the portal gun? Man, the game just got mad weird in a fantastic way. Number 3, increase rewards for exploration. This ties back to my complaint about the mods. Initially, I loved finding secret areas, but after I realized my reward most of the time was a loot box, I stopped caring. Mods dropped constantly as it was, and annoyed me more than they helped me. Creating tucked away places is a great idea, but Remedy really didn't incentivize the player enough to seek out mysteries. Some players probably enjoyed searching for every little upgrade or depository of loot off the beaten path, but as these systems are designed now, I explored less and less as my campaign progressed, which is a real shame considering how beautiful and intriguing the architecture is throughout Control. So what would incentivize me? Side quests, significant upgrades to the service weapon that change how it behaves, story or lore elements, new astral plane areas and creatures, more altered items and objects of power, mods that actually do something interesting. And, well, there's one other option that I think might be good too, if handled properly. No side areas or exploration. This can work only if the focus switches almost entirely to creating an immersive and amazing storyline to counterbalance the streamlined exploration. Think along the lines of Uncharted. This is not necessarily a direction I would prefer, but it is another choice to consider in a sequel. Speaking of the story, oh boy, do I have some thoughts. Control's story is split into two very distinct portions. Jessie struggled to locate her long-lost brother, and all the other side stories and lore associated with the Federal Bureau of Control. Jessie's tale is mostly okay and also disappointing. The opening of Jessie locating the oldest house, coupled with her obtaining the service weapon and becoming director, are some of the best opening hours to a game I've ever played. Full stop. The hooks were cast into my flesh, and Remedy reeled me to shore. Everything felt foreign in a good way. What is the Federal Bureau of Control? Who is Ahti the janitor? Why is Jessie's brother missing? Who or what is Polaris? The questions piled higher and higher, with trinkets of information giving me just enough to keep me pressing forward. This continued for several hours, and even though the facial animations and stilted dialogue kept me from fully enjoying the story beats, my curiosity wanted more. Unfortunately, this doesn't last, despite me really wanting it to. Side note, why does no one have a tongue in this game? Like, really, look at them. No tongues. I'm sorry, but once I noticed that, I couldn't unsee it. Apologies to those affected by my affliction now.
Wish you weren't so fucking awkward, bud.
Moving on. Control benefits from J.J. Abrams' Mystery Box, made famous by his TED Talk, the TV show Lost, and movie Cloverfield. The idea of the Mystery Box is to present enigmas to the audience without ever really answering them. If done well, the audience should be mostly satisfied, but not completely, so they will continue to think about the story long after playing or watching.
There you are. You are here about the job. Janitor's assistant. You need to go to the interview. Go that way to the elevator.
Thanks.
The mystery is built into the tale, and explaining too much or revealing the wrong answer can ruin the experience. This is what Remedy does with Jessie's story, and not in a clever way. I'm not going to ruin her trials and tribulations. I don't think doing a beat-by-beat breakdown would be all that interesting if I'm being honest, simply because there really isn't that much meat on the bones as the opening moments imply. There are a couple of neat turns, but overall, all the interesting parts of Jessie's journey get over-explained in exposition dumps, and there are a lot of exposition dumps. I find exposition does have a place. If I'm brought into a world different from reality, like with Final Fantasy, The Witcher, or really any fantasy or sci-fi setting, I expect an info dump. At some point, I'm going to need the basics of the world explained to me. That could be from a character interaction or a cinematic. That's fine. And from the moment I started Control, I knew a couple info dumps were in order. But these are handled so poorly. They are spoken like a logbook entry rather than a conversation. It felt like the writers and developers were speaking to the player rather than that character sitting in front of Jessie. Combine this with the animations, and it's a bit of a disaster, especially compared to how polished the rest of the game and lore is. Jessie is someone I really wanted to like, but I found her annoying the longer the campaign went. Her internal monologues went overboard, injecting at regular frequency, not unlike JD from Scrubs.
Been looking for this place for a long time.
That's enough. Maybe that's too much already. I can't tell her about Dylan and the rest yet.
She just wouldn't shut up. And to top it off, she also spoke in a way that made it feel like the writers wanted to speak directly with the player instead of Jessie speaking to herself or Polaris. It didn't feel like a stream of consciousness. It felt like reading a script. You might be sensing a theme by now. Overall, Jessie's quest became less and less interesting to me, in part because everyone in the story talks and looks unnaturally, and also in part because the mysteries that got revealed didn't matter, or were something that should have stayed hidden to keep the player's interest. I kept waiting for a big revelation or moment to occur, particularly surrounding my main man Ahti, but nothing came of it. Her story ended up being a fairly average one despite the amazing world it takes place in. The stakes never felt high, and frankly, didn't really escalate all that much from the beginning. I'm not entirely sure what I expected from Control regarding its story, but it didn't deliver either way. The lore is another thing altogether, and to paraphrase Skill Up, it felt like a bunch of different teams worked on different aspects of the game and story. The team who did the lore entries, side quests, and Dr. Darling's videos crushed it. I'm normally not big on collectibles. Finding ancient relics in Uncharted or heart containers in The Legend of Zelda just doesn't really interest me all that much. There are exceptions, of course, if the collectibles are worth getting or I'm in love with everything else the game is doing. However, I'm more inclined to get the heart containers than some golden medallion because at least the containers enhance my gaming experience. Control is neither of these examples. Its collectibles, the ones worth talking about anyway, are entirely lore-based and exist solely to fill in the backstory and world. They range from journals to audio tapes to videos and even puppet shows. The variety of subject matter and presentation helps keep them from getting stale. I'll admit, their frequency unnerved me at first. I couldn't go into a room without picking up something telling me to go into my menu to read. I worried the entries would lose their mystery box appeal because of the volume. I was wrong. My intrigue only deepened as I read into subjects that I would never encounter again. Because of how interesting these are, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about these entries. I'm not going to be the first one to say that Control is clearly inspired by the SCP, or the Serve Contain Protect Foundation, or just the Foundation. SCP is a collection of short stories or database entries for a fictional, non-governmental group that defends the world from various objects and entities that could or do pose a threat to humanity. These SCPs, for short, are often bizarre or terrifying, leaning into the fears of the ordinary suddenly becoming extraordinary. Examples include a stairwell that never ends, a statue that kills people if someone stops looking at it, a pizza box that will create the operator's favorite pizza, a flesh-consuming monstrosity that adds the person's flesh to its own, or even an entire US state only existing in the minds of those who claim to live or visit there. Their creativity on display is very impressive. If you played Control, a lot of this sounds familiar. The SCPF and FBC are similar institutions with seemingly unlimited jurisdiction with the goal of securing objects displaying unusual abilities or interactions. One big distinction, however, is Control's objects have an explanation for their existence, the unconscious emotions and thoughts of humanity. Now, I'm not going to pretend I understand all the ins and outs of this. If you want a super deep dive, I recommend checking out Gaming University's videos on Control. He does an incredible job and knows the subject matter better than me. But I'll do my best here. My understanding is Control borrows the idea from Karl Jung that our unconscious thoughts can manifest or influence happenings in the real world. It also borrows the idea of a collective unconsciousness that resides in a different reality called the astral plane. Both the astral plane and our thoughts can cause phenomena. The famous example Jung presents is of a unique beetle species appearing in his office the day after he dreams about this particular type of beetle, which is not native to his area. In a nutshell, sometimes these emotions and thoughts present themselves in reality through events or objects. Control takes this and runs about as far as it can take it without becoming too outlandish like SCPs sometimes do. These objects and the lore surrounding how they came to be present the most interesting parts of Control's world. Even though the objects get a backstory and the explanation of Karl Jung's ideas makes sense, nothing is fully revealed. Nothing loses its mystery to the point of banality, and keeping this mystery is the key to the lore entries and side quests remaining fresh while the main plot peters out. On that note, my favorite parts of the Chief campaign are Dr. Darling and the paranatural janitor Ahti. Dr. Darling because of the mystery surrounding his disappearance and excellent performance by Matthew Peretta.
Brooding upon our world in the form of altered world events. These forces gravitate toward archetypal objects, a gun, a television, a supposedly haunted house.
And the janitor because of Marty Marty Suosalos.
Good evening. My name is Martti Suosalo.
10-4, good buddy.
Performance, as well as the subtle hints that Ahti might be an extra-dimensional god helping humanity. Yeah, really, it's pretty neat stuff.
Yeah, you think there's a dog buried in this? I can tell you are not yesterday's Krause's son. That's why you'll make a great assistant.
So, after saying all this, how do I feel about Control's world building and story? Well, This is the point where I disagree with how Remedy handled Jesse's story and all the other lore in the game because, well, that's what I do.
Thank you, gentleman who obviously has a very high opinion of himself.
Lord J. Lowe.
If I had to create a story within the framework of what Remedy built, it would focus less on Jessie finding her brother and more on the mysteries of Ahti, the Board, the Hiss, and Dr. Darling. But, above all that, I would focus on the altered items, objects of power, and how they relate to the functions of the Federal Bureau of Control. In fact, I would remove Jesse's brother entirely from the story. He muddles everything and acts more like a MacGuffin than an actual person Jesse cares about. So, let's do things differently. I like that Jessie stumbles upon the oldest house and that she becomes the director. This can still easily happen because of Polaris. Focus on this transition by focusing on how the board interacts with the FBC and Jessie. She is far too trusting of them, and the lack of tension between FBC and the board was a big letdown for me, especially considering the Hiss also comes from the astral plane. Why trust the board when many things and entities from the astral plane have no qualms about murdering people?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Give the player more side quests involving altered items gone amok. Some of these were better than anything else in the game, and because of the nature of these items, the creativity floodgates could be opened with very little consequence. More of that, please. I'd leave Ahti alone, actually. His mysterious ways are better left unexplained in any great depth. Finally, Dr. Darling. His relationship with the Board, Hedron, Polaris, and the Hiss is perhaps the best through line of the entire game. I don't know if I would change this much, but Jessie's attention could shift from her brother to Dr. Darling. Yes, it would be exchanging one MacGuffin for another, but at least this one is interesting. Basically, Jessie's story needed a reworking. The best parts of the game hide behind lore entries and side quests. Bring these into the forefront. I'm assuming a sequel is planned, so here's to hoping Jessie gets fleshed out more while also skipping all the internal dialogue. Control is an artistic endeavor on the precipice of mastery. A few tweaks to the story and gameplay would make this game an all-time classic, talked about several generations from now, but it doesn't quite make it to that level, and not for lack of trying, as represented by the number of Game of the Year awards it received in 2019. Saying that, I can easily recommend Control. It doesn't overstay its welcome. The combat is exhilarating, and the story, while uninspired in parts, provides enough intrigue to make most players want to see its conclusion. As I stated earlier, the game really shines when the player can express themselves in combat at the highest tiers of difficulty, and when the lore goes off the rails to give an experience no other game can. The technical expertise on display, which I barely touched on in this review, mostly due to other reviewers with more knowledge doing a better job than I ever could, is still very impressive, even to a layman like myself. The environments clearly show a great level of care, and I often found myself just taking in the scenery. Some people might say I nitpicked Control to death in this review, pointing out minor flaws as if they were major ones, and inserting my ideas as if I could make a game like this myself. To those people I say two things. One, I don't really care, as this review is my experience with the game. And two, the more critique I lend to a game, the more I generally enjoyed it. Control is utterly enthralling at times. It's also disconnected and disjointed in many ways. From the opening moments, I wanted to fall in love with it, but I was let down by numerous small decisions by Remedy. If the game didn't present itself in such a polished fashion, I probably would have focused my attention on other broken areas. But that's not the case. Control is very polished. It is very well put together. That's what makes the shortcomings stand out a lot more than with a lesser accomplished game. Some of my issues are certainly down to personal taste. When I say Control came close to being an all-time great but didn't quite get there, I wasn't alone. Metacritic, not always the best or most reliable metric, but it's something to work with, has Control sitting at a comfortable 85. That is fantastic, and probably where I would put it if I gave out scores. It is a wonderful game with a creepy paranatural premise that I feel most gamers would enjoy. So if you get the opportunity to play it, I definitely think it is worth the scratch and time investment, and you wouldn't even have to travel to a foreboding building run by a secretive government agency.
It's like we live in a room, and there's a poster on the wall. We stare at it and we think that's the whole world. The room and the poster. The picture's something nice. A landscape, a famous person. Like in that movie, what is it called? The prison movie. The room's a cell, and the picture, it's different for each of us. It can be beautiful or terrible, but we're all transfixed. But it's all a lie. Something to distract us from the truth. They're lying to us. We're lying to ourselves. The room's not the world. The world is much bigger and much stranger. There's a hole hidden behind that poster that leads to the real world. We all feel safe in that room. But sometimes something crawls out from behind the poster. And the ones that see it happen freak out and try to forget what they saw. I'm here. Why did you bring me here?